He didn't escape prison. He didn't hide from the law. He simply lost a piece of paper. And for that, he disappeared from the world. For 27 years, a man lived inside an airport terminal, not as a traveler, not as a citizen, not even as a refugee. Just as a presence. This is not a story about adventure. It's not about survival in the wilderness. It's about something quieter. Something colder. It's about what happens when the modern world deletes your identity and nothing physically stops you, yet you cannot move. This is the story of Mehran Karimi Nasseri, the man who lived in transit for nearly 3 decades. He didn't break out of prison. He didn't flee from justice. He didn't commit a crime that forced him into hiding. He simply lost his documents, and with them, his place in the world. In 1988, Mehran Karimi Nasseri arrived at Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris carrying refugee papers and a plan to reach the United Kingdom. Somewhere between departure and arrival, those papers disappeared. Stolen, misplaced, invalidated, it didn't matter which version was true. What mattered was that without documentation, he was no one the system could process. And in the modern world, if the system cannot process you, it cannot allow you to move. Airports are built for motion. They are engineered arteries of globalization where thousands of lives pass through every hour. Announcements echo, luggage rolls, departure boards flicker. Everything flows forward. But Nasseri stopped. French authorities would not admit him without valid entry documents. Airlines would not let him board without a passport. Other countries would not accept him without proof of status. He was physically present in France yet legally nowhere. He could not step outside the airport, and he could not leave it by plane. So he remained inside Terminal 1, in the neutral zone between arrival and departure, suspended in administrative limbo. At first, he believed the problem would resolve in days. Then weeks. He slept on a red plastic bench, keeping his few belongings in airport carts. He washed in public restrooms and organized his life around flight schedules. He read newspapers left behind by passengers, carefully stacking them after finishing each article. He wrote notes to structure his days, as if discipline could prevent psychological collapse. Days turned into months. Months turned into years. The terminal lighting never changed. The air was always recycled. Time inside an airport does not move like normal time, it is measured by announcements, not seasons. He was not behind bars. No one chained him to that bench. Yet he could not cross the invisible line that separated transit from territory. Nations recognize passports, not people. Borders acknowledge status, not stories. Nasseri had once been recognized as a refugee, but without the physical proof, that recognition dissolved. Governments require documents to confirm identity, without them, identity becomes a rumor. He existed in a bureaucratic blind spot, too present to ignore, too undefined to accept. Airport staff slowly grew accustomed to him. Some brought food. Others spoke with him during quiet shifts. For many employees, he became part of the architecture, as permanent as the information desk or the departure board. Travelers would notice him, whisper, sometimes take photographs. Children who once passed him on family vacations eventually returned years later as adults and saw the same man sitting in the same place. The world accelerated around him, new technologies, new conflicts, new generations, while his reality remained fixed to a bench under fluorescent lights. Over time, something shifted. Waiting stopped feeling temporary. The airport, once a symbol of transition, became stable. Predictable. Safe in its repetition. The outside world grew abstract, almost theoretical. Movement requires certainty, and certainty requires identity. Without a stable legal identity, the idea of departure became more frightening than the familiarity of confinement. When opportunities reportedly arose that might have allowed him to regularize his status and leave, the decision was no longer simple. After years in limbo, transit itself had become his only defined state. His story later inspired the film The Terminal, but cinema reshaped isolation into something sentimental. In reality, there was no orchestral soundtrack, no charming misunderstandings resolved by humor. There was monotony. There was paperwork circulating between offices. There was the slow erosion of personal narrative. When you repeat the same routine for years in a place designed only for passage, you begin to dissolve into it. Identity requires reflection from others, recognition, validation, documentation. Without those, the self becomes fragile. For 18 years, he lived inside that airport. Not as a citizen, not as a tourist, not even as a formal refugee, but as an unresolved case file. He was eventually hospitalized and removed from the terminal in 2006, later residing in shelters in Paris. In 2022, he died in the very airport that had once contained his life. Not in departure. Not in arrival. But in transit. His story is not about physical survival. It is about administrative disappearance. There was no violence, no dramatic catastrophe. Just the quiet force of bureaucracy. In a world structured by databases and documentation, existence is conditional. Lose the paper, and you lose movement. Lose movement, and you lose participation. And when participation disappears, identity begins to fade, not suddenly, not loudly, but slowly, under fluorescent lights, while the world walks past you toward its gates. At some point, the question stopped being how he would leave and became who he was becoming. When a person is removed from ordinary social roles, employee, citizen, neighbor, passenger, something subtle fractures. Human identity is reinforced through interaction. Documents confirm legality, work confirms usefulness, relationships confirm belonging. Nasseri had none of these in any formal sense. What he had instead was repetition. The same bench. The same tiled floors. The same announcements cycling through languages that promised departure to everyone but him. He reportedly began introducing himself with variations of his name, sometimes adjusting details of his biography. Not necessarily out of deception, but out of erosion. When no official structure consistently affirms your identity, it becomes unstable. Memory shifts. Narrative adapts. The story of who you are becomes the only territory you fully control. In that environment, storytelling is not performance, it is survival. If the state will not archive you properly, you archive yourself. Consider the psychological weight of indefinite waiting. Most forms of hardship contain an endpoint. A sentence has a release date, a contract has an expiration, even exile typically has a political resolution. Nasseri's situation had no visible horizon. Bureaucracy does not operate on human urgency. Files move when processed. Appeals move when reviewed. Errors move when acknowledged. He was not fighting a villain, he was navigating indifference. And indifference is harder to confront than hostility because it offers no clear opposition. Airports are paradoxical spaces. They symbolize freedom of movement, globalization, opportunity. Yet they are also some of the most controlled environments in modern society. Surveillance cameras track movement. Border agents assess legitimacy. Every gate is a checkpoint. Nasseri lived inside this machine of regulation without being fully processed by it. He was visible yet undefined, monitored yet unclassified. In many ways, he embodied a contradiction at the heart of the modern world. Mobility is celebrated, but only for those who can prove who they are. Years passed. Political landscapes shifted. Governments changed leadership. International policies evolved. Yet his case remains suspended. It is tempting to interpret his continued stay as stubbornness or passivity, but long-term institutional limbo alters perception. When your environment narrows for years, decision-making itself becomes distorted. The world outside grows unpredictable in your imagination. The known discomfort of the terminal may feel safer than the unknown chaos beyond it. Stability, even artificial stability, can become addictive. Passengers occasionally attempted conversation. Journalists documented his presence. Researchers analyzed his case as an example of statelessness and bureaucratic paradox. But analysis does not equate to resolution. For observers, he was a story. For him, it was simply daily life. There is a profound asymmetry in that dynamic. The world can intellectualize your suffering while you continue living inside it. His existence also exposed a structural truth about modern governance. Citizenship is not merely cultural belonging, it is administrative recognition. Without recognition, rights are inaccessible. Healthcare, employment, housing, mobility all depend on status verification. Statelessness is not just a political category, it is a functional erasure. Nasseri's prolonged stay in the airport demonstrated how fragile identity becomes when reduced to paperwork. We assume identity is intrinsic. In practice, it is institutional. Over time, he reportedly accumulated belongings, documents, letters, notes, reading material. These objects formed a perimeter around his bench, a symbolic boundary marking space in a place not designed for permanence. It was a small assertion of territory in a transit zone. When you cannot claim a country, you claim a few square meters of tile. When you cannot secure citizenship, you secure routine. The fluorescent lighting never dimmed for night. Sleep was fragmented. Noise was constant. Imagine trying to sustain mental stability in an environment that never truly rests. Airports are engineered for temporary endurance, not for habitation. Yet he adapted. Humans are capable of extraordinary normalization. What shocks visitors can become background noise to residents. That adaptation, however, often comes at a psychological cost: a narrowing of ambition, a shrinking of expectation. His story forces a confrontation with an uncomfortable reality: modern systems are optimized for efficiency, not for anomalies. If your situation fits established categories, the system functions. If it does not, you risk falling between definitions. Nasseri was not entirely rejected, but he was not entirely accepted. He was pending. And pending status can last indefinitely when no authority assumes decisive responsibility. When he was eventually hospitalized in 2006 and removed from the airport, it marked the end of an era, but not a dramatic liberation. There was no triumphant return to a homeland, no celebratory arrival at a new destination. The transition from terminal to shelter was administrative, quiet, procedural. The limbo changed form, but uncertainty remained embedded in his life. He died in 2022 inside the same airport that had once confined him. The symmetry is stark. A man who spent years unable to depart ultimately ended his life in transit. It is almost too metaphorical, yet entirely factual. His existence challenges the assumption that freedom is purely physical. He was not locked behind bars, yet he lacked the legal architecture necessary for autonomy. The absence of recognition functioned as an invisible barrier more durable than steel. In the end, the story of the man who lived 27 years in an airport is not about eccentric endurance. It is about structural fragility. It is about how identity, in the modern era, is mediated through documents, databases, and bureaucratic acknowledgement. Remove those, and a person can remain physically present while socially erased. Not through violence. Not through exile in the traditional sense. But through procedural omission. And perhaps the most unsettling aspect is how quietly it happened. No sirens. No headlines dominating global news for years. Just a man on a bench, under artificial light, while thousands walked past him toward destinations he could see but never reach. There is a particular cruelty in being surrounded by movement while remaining immobile. Every departure board in that terminal functioned as a reminder of possibility. London. Rome. New York. Tehran. Cities blinking in yellow letters, announcing opportunities measured in minutes. Boarding. Final call. Gate closing. Each announcement confirmed that the world was in motion. Each announcement confirmed that he was not. The psychology of prolonged suspension does not explode, it compresses. Urgency dissolves first. Then expectation. Eventually even resentment can fade, replaced by a kind of mechanical acceptance. When days become indistinguishable, ambition contracts to manageable units: finish the newspaper, reorganize the notes, observe the flow of passengers. Survival becomes procedural rather than hopeful. The mind adapts by lowering the scale of its future. Observers often search for a dramatic explanation, a legal mistake, a single decision that could have reversed everything. But reality is rarely so precise. Statelessness is often cumulative. A missing stamp, a delayed response, a lost file, a policy shift. Each element individually minor, collectively decisive. Systems are designed to handle volume, not complexity. When a case becomes complicated enough, it can stagnate without deliberate malice. Bureaucratic inertia is not violent, yet its consequences can be enduring. He became, in effect, a living contradiction of globalization. Airports represent borderless commerce and international connectivity. They symbolize access. Yet his life within that space revealed that movement is conditional. Freedom of travel is not universal, it is granted. It depends on compliance with layers of verification invisible to those who pass through effortlessly. For most travelers, presenting a passport is a brief inconvenience. For him, the absence of one defined decades. Over time, the narrative surrounding him drifted from tragedy to curiosity. Tourists photographed him. Journalists retold his story with varying details. He became known as the man who lives in the airport, a phrase that sounds almost fictional. Language softened the severity. Living suggests choice, remaining suggests preference. But structural confinement rarely feels dramatic from the outside. It looks passive. It looks voluntary. The absence of visible force makes the constraint harder to perceive. There is also the matter of institutional accountability. When multiple governments intersect in a single case, responsibility diffuses. One authority cites jurisdictional limits. Another references documentation gaps. Each step appears reasonable in isolation. Yet the cumulative effect is paralysis. The system does not need to reject you explicitly if it can simply defer resolution indefinitely. His notebooks reportedly contained reflections, fragments of autobiography, attempts to organize identity on paper. Writing can serve as self-verification when external verification fails. If the state will not certify who you articulate it yourself. But self-definition lacks legal power. It can preserve coherence internally, yet it cannot open a gate. The longer he remained, the more the airport adapted around him. Staff shifts incorporated his presence into routine awareness. Security protocols accounted for him. Vendors recognized him. Institutional tolerance replaced urgency. Once an anomaly becomes familiar, it loses priority. He was no longer an emergency, he was a constant. Time altered the broader world as well. The late 1980s geopolitical climate that shaped his initial displacement gave way to new global conflicts, new security regimes, new immigration policies. After September 11, 2001, airport security intensified dramatically across the world. Identity verification became even more rigid. The environment in which he lived grew more controlled, not less. Surveillance expanded. Documentation requirements tightened. If anything, the structural barriers hardened. His case also illuminated a paradox of modern humanitarian systems. Refugee frameworks are designed to provide protection, yet they rely on documentation chains that can fracture. When those chains break, the individual can fall into a legal vacuum. Protection becomes theoretical if it cannot be validated. Nasseri's prolonged stay in the airport was not simply personal misfortune, it was evidence of procedural vulnerability within international governance. Some accounts suggest that over time, the prospect of leaving the airport induced anxiety. After nearly 2 decades, the terminal was comprehensible. The external world required reintegration, adaptation, uncertainty. When identity has been suspended for years, rebuilding it demands psychological energy that may no longer be available. Stability, even artificial stability, can feel preferable to risk. When he was finally removed due to health concerns, the transition did not restore lost years. Institutional time does not reverse. The decades inside Terminal 1 were irreversible. They were not paused life, they were life. That distinction matters. It is tempting to describe his airport years as an interruption. But for him, they constituted adulthood, aging, routine, memory. The terminal was not a waiting room preceding existence. It was existence. His death in the airport in 2022 closes the narrative with unsettling symmetry. A life defined by transit concluded in transit. It underscores a stark principle: modern identity is infrastructural. It depends on recognition by systems larger than any individual. Remove recognition, and autonomy collapses. Not because of overt brutality, but because access is denied at every interface: travel, employment, residency. The deeper darkness in his story lies in its subtlety. There was no dramatic exile to a remote island. No visible imprisonment behind iron bars. He sat under artificial light while thousands of people passed him every day. Society functioned normally around him. Flights departed on schedule. Commerce continued. Governments operated. His erasure did not disrupt the system, it was absorbed by it. In that sense, his life was not an anomaly outside the modern order but a byproduct of it. A demonstration of how rigidly structured systems handle irregular cases. He was not crushed by force, he was immobilized by procedure. And procedure, when misaligned with human complexity, can be as final as any sentence. The man who lived 27 years in an airport did not vanish physically. He remained visible, seated on a bench beneath departure boards. What vanished was his ability to participate. His ability to be recognized as a full legal subject. His ability to move. And in a world defined by mobility, movement is identity. Without it, existence narrows to a fixed point on a terminal floor, surrounded by destinations, yet belonging to none. Mobility is often described as freedom, but in practice it is authorization. The modern world advertises openness, global trade, international education, borderless communication, yet all of it rests on layered permissions. Swipe the correct passport at the gate and the barrier lifts. Present the wrong one, or none at all, and the barrier becomes permanent. Nasseri's life exposed how thin the line is between inclusion and exclusion. It is not drawn in geography. It is drawn in documentation. For years he occupied a physical space that technically belonged to no nation in the traditional sense. International terminals operate as control thresholds, zones where sovereignty is enforced but not fully extended. They are engineered to hold people temporarily while their legitimacy is verified. Temporary became indefinite. The architecture assumed rotation, he introduced permanence. The design assumed throughput, he introduced stillness. In that friction between design and reality, his life unfolded. He aged under fluorescent light. Aging is usually marked by progression, career milestones, family events, relocations, transitions from one phase of life to another. His aging was marked by continuity. The same bench. The same tile. The same rhythm of arrivals and departures. Biological time moved forward. Social time did not. That divergence is disorienting. When your body advances but your circumstances remain static, the future loses dimensionality. There is also the question of dignity. Statelessness is often discussed in legal terms, but its psychological weight is quieter. When every official interaction hinges on proof you cannot provide, your self-perception shifts. Each refusal is procedural, not personal, yet it accumulates. You are not being told you are worthless, you are being told you are unverifiable. The difference is subtle but profound. Worth can be debated. Verification is binary. The airport community developed around him in fragments. Some employees reportedly treated him with empathy, offering small gestures of kindness. Those gestures mattered. They affirmed presence if not status. Yet kindness does not substitute for rights. Informal support cannot replace formal recognition. Compassion may soften the edges of exclusion, but it cannot dissolve it. His case circulated through legal channels intermittently. Appeals, reviews, reconsiderations. But bureaucratic processes often operate at a tempo disconnected from lived urgency. A delay in paperwork for a traveler is inconvenience. A delay for a stateless individual is suspension. Multiply the delay by years and the suspension becomes structural. The world around him digitized rapidly during his stay. In the late 1980s, travel documentation relied heavily on physical records and manual verification. By the early 2000s, biometric passports, centralized databases, and integrated border systems were emerging. Identity became increasingly data-driven. Ironically, as verification technologies advanced, flexibility narrowed. Systems optimized for accuracy are less tolerant of ambiguity. If your data does not align, the system does not improvise. He became a fixed reference point in a dynamic environment. Travelers used him as a landmark, near the man who lives here. In a space defined by impermanence, he symbolized endurance. But endurance in this context was not heroic. It was imposed. He endured because the alternative resolution remained out of reach. The terminal itself functioned as a controlled ecosystem. Climate regulated. Security constant. Artificial lighting continuous. It shielded him from certain external dangers, weather, street violence, economic precarity, yet it also confined him to a narrow experiential range. Exposure to novelty diminished. Autonomy narrowed to microchoices: which newspaper to read, where to sit, when to sleep. Macrochoices: where to live, where to work, where to belong, were inaccessible. Belonging is often invisible until it is removed. Citizens rarely contemplate the infrastructure that validates them. It is background noise: birth registration, national ID systems, passport issuance, census inclusion. When those systems fail or exclude, the absence becomes central. Nasseri's prolonged stay in the airport illuminated how much of modern existence depends on invisible administrative scaffolding. Some interpreted his continued residence as stubbornness, suggesting he could have resolved his case by accepting certain terms. But long-term limbo distorts perception. Decision-making under chronic uncertainty differs from decision-making under stability. When the ground beneath you has been unstable for years, even a potential solution can feel precarious. Trust in institutions erodes gradually. Confidence in outcomes weakens. His life also raises uncomfortable reflections about visibility. Thousands saw him. Journalists documented him. Filmmakers dramatized a version of his story. Yet visibility did not equate to resolution. Exposure can generate awareness without producing structural change. A story can circulate globally while the subject remains stationary. When he eventually left the airport due to health complications, it did not rewrite the decades that preceded it. The years inside Terminal 1 were not recoverable. They were not deferred life, they were lived life. Each day contributed to his history, even if that history unfolded within a few hundred square meters of controlled space. His death in the airport compresses the narrative into a stark symbol, but symbols can obscure complexity. He was not merely a metaphor for statelessness. He was an individual navigating a convergence of political upheaval, administrative failure, and psychological adaptation. Yet the symbolic dimension remains powerful, a man confined not by walls, but by the absence of recognition. The darkness in this story is not dramatic. It is procedural. It is the slow accumulation of unresolved status. It is the realization that modern existence is conditional upon systems functioning correctly. When those systems falter, the consequences are not always explosive. Sometimes they are silent and prolonged. A bench in a terminal became a substitute for territory. A stack of newspapers became routine. A set of missing documents became destiny. Around him, aircraft engines roared, lifting thousands into the sky each day. Movement was constant, mechanical, reliable. His stillness was equally constant. He did not disappear physically. He remained in plain sight. What disappeared was his ability to transition from one recognized state to another. In a world structured around movement, geographical, social, economic stasis becomes a form of erasure. And that is the quiet severity of his life, not confinement through force, but confinement through omission. Not exile to a distant land, but suspension in a space designed only for passing through. Not a violent stripping of identity, but its gradual administrative evaporation under the glow of departure boards that never called his name. The longer a person remains outside formal recognition, the more abstract their existence becomes to institutions. Files are archived. Administrators rotate. Policies update. What was once an urgent case becomes a historical anomaly. But the human being at the center of it does not reset with each bureaucratic cycle. He wakes up in the same place. He carries the same uncertainty. Institutional time refreshes, personal time accumulates. Inside that terminal, he witnessed thousands of reunions. Families embracing after long separations. Business partners shaking hands before negotiations. Lovers crying at gates before departures. Airports amplify emotion because they compress transition. For most, those emotions are temporary spikes in otherwise stable lives. For him, they were daily theater. He watched other people's turning points while remaining suspended at his own. The architecture of Terminal 1 was circular and enclosed, looping structure. That physical circularity mirrored his condition. Every attempt to exit returned to the same legal impasse. Circular design, circular status, circular time. There is a psychological weight to living inside a loop. Progress feels theoretical. Effort feels repetitive. Eventually, the mind conserves energy by narrowing expectation. He was not the only stateless person in the world, but his visibility made the condition tangible. Statelessness is usually hidden in refugee camps, detention centers, remote borders. In his case, it unfolded in one of Europe's busiest airports. The contrast was stark: high-speed global connectivity on one side, complete personal immobility on the other. The system that enables frictionless travel for millions can simultaneously immobilize one. Legal scholars later examined his case as an illustration of gaps between national jurisdictions. Each state operates within defined boundaries. When a case straddles those boundaries without clean documentation, responsibility fragments. Fragmentation produces delay. Delay produces limbo. Limbo, when prolonged, reshapes identity. Identity is not only how you see yourself, it is how systems categorize you. Employment databases, immigration records, national registries, these define access. Without entry into those systems, participation is restricted. Nasseri's prolonged stay demonstrated that identity in the modern era is infrastructural. It is not purely personal or cultural, it is embedded in administrative networks. Remove the infrastructure, and the person becomes functionally isolated. There is also a deeper philosophical tension in his story: the difference between existence and recognition. Philosophically, a person exists independent of documentation. Legally, existence without documentation has limited consequence. Rights are triggered by recognition. Without recognition, rights remain dormant. He existed biologically, socially, visibly. Yet his capacity to exercise rights was suspended. Over years, repetition becomes sediment. It layers quietly. A day on a bench feels survivable. A week feels inconvenient. A year feels surreal. A decade feels irreversible. Accumulated repetition erodes the imagination of alternatives. The extraordinary becomes ordinary through exposure. That normalization may be the most insidious adaptation of all. The airport environment also insulated him from certain social expectations. Outside, adulthood carries pressures: career progression, financial independence, relational commitments. Inside the terminal, those metrics dissolved. His world narrowed to maintenance. Survival without progression. Routine without trajectory. In some sense, the airport became a contained ecosystem where broader societal benchmarks lost relevance. Yet containment is not neutrality. It extracts opportunity cost. The years spent in transit could not be invested elsewhere. Relationships that might have formed did not. Professional contributions that might have emerged did not. The subtraction is invisible because it is counterfactual. You cannot measure what never materialized. The silence surrounding his daily life is striking. Most people's lives are punctuated by transitions, moving homes, changing jobs, traveling between cities. His narrative is defined by continuity. Continuity without choice. Stability without agency. It challenges the assumption that consistency is inherently positive. Stability imposed from outside can function as constraint. When he eventually left the terminal due to health decline, the departure was not celebratory. It was procedural, medical, quiet. After nearly 2 decades, the airport had become an extension of his identity. Removing him did not restore lost citizenship or retroactively repair bureaucratic fractures. It simply altered the physical. There is something almost clinical about that environment. Clean floors. Controlled temperature. Surveillance without intimacy. You are observed, but not known. Monitored, but not understood. Nasseri lived under constant visibility without relational anchoring. Thousands saw him, few knew him. Visibility without belonging can intensify isolation. He reportedly maintained routines with precision. Routine is a stabilizing mechanism under uncertainty. It introduces predictability where none externally exists. When you cannot control your legal status, you control the arrangement of your belongings. When you cannot direct your destination, you direct your schedule. These microcontrols prevent psychological disintegration. But microcontrol cannot replace macroagency. Agency requires options. He had limited ones. Step outside and risk detention. Attempt to board and face refusal. Remain seated and endure continuity. The least disruptive choice became the default choice. Over time, default becomes identity. His situation also reflects how systems manage anomalies through tolerance rather than correction. He was not forcibly removed for years because his presence did not threaten operational flow. He adapted to the system's rhythms, the system adapted to his presence. A quiet equilibrium formed. Equilibrium, however, is not justice. It is merely stability. Consider the broader implications. Millions of people cross international borders daily. Each interaction at immigration control represents a moment of judgment, entry granted or denied. Most never consider how narrow the threshold is. A missing stamp. An expired visa. An incorrect code. The outcome can change entirely. Nasseri's life magnified that threshold, stretching it across decades. There is also an existential dimension that extends beyond law. Identity, stripped of documents, becomes internal narrative. But internal narrative lacks external reinforcement. Over time, without societal mirrors, self-concept can blur. If no institution affirms who you are, you begin to exist in a vacuum of confirmation. He was not forgotten by everyone. His story circulated periodically in media. Scholars referenced him. Filmmakers fictionalized him. Yet attention did not equate to integration. The gap between storytelling and structural resolution remained intact. The most unsettling aspect is how ordinary the mechanism was. No conspiracy. No deliberate cruelty. Just rigid adherence to procedure. Systems operate on rules because rules ensure consistency. But consistency applied without flexibility can generate human casualties of a quieter kind. When he finally left the airport due to medical necessity, it did not mark triumph. It marked biological limitation. The body eventually overrides institutional stasis. Years in a terminal take a physical toll: limited mobility, constrained diet, chronic stress. The environment that once functioned as shelter becomes unsustainable. His later years were less visible, less documented. The world moved on. New crises captured attention. Yet the structural lesson of his life remains embedded in the architecture of modern governance. Citizenship is access. Access is participation. Participation is existence within the system. Remove one, and the others destabilize. He died in the same airport that had defined him. Not because it was home in the traditional sense, but because it was the site where identity was suspended. The departure board continued to flicker above him long after he could no longer read it. Flights continued to lift into the sky. Travelers continued to cross borders with the correct papers in hand. The machine of mobility never paused. And that is perhaps the final image that lingers, an individual immobilized inside a structure built for acceleration. A man whose life narrowed to a bench beneath gates leading everywhere except forward. Not imprisoned by bars. Not exiled to a distant shore. But suspended inside the procedural heart of modern civilization. A life defined not by where he went, but by where he could not. A man present in one of the busiest places on earth, yet administratively absent from the world. And in the end, that absence was enough. Absence is rarely loud. It does not announce itself. It does not demand attention. It simply persists, unnoticed by the mechanisms that created it. That is what makes Nasseri's story so unsettling. His confinement did not require guards. It required compliance with rules that no longer applied to him in any coherent way. Modern civilization is built on categorization. Every individual must fit somewhere: citizen, resident, visitor, refugee. These categories determine access to healthcare, employment, travel, legal protection. When a person slips between them, the system does not know how to respond. It is not designed for undefined variables. It is designed for sorting. He became an undefined variable. An airport is one of the most controlled spaces in existence. Every movement is regulated. Every individual is assessed. Boarding passes are scanned. Identities are verified. Security is layered. It is a machine optimized for certainty. Nasseri lived inside that machine as an exception it could not fully process. He was not cleared for entry. He was not cleared for departure. He existed in a permanent verification error. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from prolonged uncertainty. Not the sharp exhaustion of crisis, but the slow fatigue of suspended resolution. When nothing changes for years, the nervous system adapts by lowering expectation. Hope becomes inefficient. Planning becomes irrelevant. The future shrinks to the next meal, the next sleep cycle, the next announcement overhead. He witnessed the world transform without participating in it. The Cold War ended. The European Union expanded. The Internet reshaped communication. Smartphones replaced paper tickets. Biometric passports became standard. Security intensified after global attacks. Generations shifted. Through all of it, he remained seated beneath departure boards that updated daily while his status did not. The contrast is stark: a world accelerating into digital interconnectedness, and one man frozen by analog documentation gaps. His case began in a period when records were still fragmented and cross-border communication slower. Yet even as technology advanced, his position remained unresolved. Progress in systems does not automatically correct past anomalies. It can even entrench them. There is also the matter of scale. Airports handle tens of thousands of travelers each day. Each traveler is a brief interaction. Nasseri was an anomaly that required sustained attention. Sustained attention is costly in bureaucratic environments. It demands coordination, legal nuance, political will. Without urgency, complex cases stagnate. He adapted his behavior to avoid conflict. Compliance became strategy. Do not disrupt operations. Do not attract security escalation. Remain visible but not problematic. Survival within institutional limbo often depends on minimizing friction. Invisibility within visibility. Yet even in compliance, there is erosion. The self is not static. It is reinforced through milestones and progression. When years pass without formal change, identity can become anchored to environment rather than aspiration. The airport ceased to be temporary infrastructure and became a defining feature of his biography. Think about the psychological inversion required to normalize that. Most people measure life by movement, relocation, advancement, travel, growth. He measured life by continuity, maintaining the same space, the same possessions, the same daily rhythm. Stability replaced ambition. Some observers speculated that over time he feared departure. That the outside world, after decades, felt foreign. This is not difficult to understand. When you live within a narrow ecosystem long enough, it becomes legible. The unpredictability of the wider world can appear overwhelming. Institutional limbo can paradoxically provide a distorted form of security. At least within the terminal, he understood the rules. But understanding rules is not the same as belonging. Belonging requires acknowledgement. It requires a system to say, you are recognized here. You are counted. You are included. Without that acknowledgement, presence becomes provisional. He occupied space without being anchored to it. His story reveals something fundamental about the architecture of the modern state: identity is transactional. You provide documentation, the state provides recognition. Break the transaction, and recognition dissolves. The human being remains, but the legal subject disappears. The haunting element of his life is how ordinary the mechanism was. No dramatic exile decree. No courtroom condemnation. Just administrative impasse. A missing document cascaded into decades of immobility. Procedure replaced force. When he died in the airport in 2022, it closed the circle in physical terms. But it did not resolve the structural questions his life raised. Statelessness still exists. Documentation still determines mobility. Borders still depend on verification systems that can fail or exclude. His life challenges the assumption that modern freedom is universal. It is conditional. It depends on paperwork aligning with databases, on identity being recognized across jurisdictions, on bureaucracies functioning without error. When that alignment fractures, the consequences are not always visible to the majority who pass effortlessly through gates. Imagine sitting beneath a departure board for years, watching destinations cycle through continents. Hearing final calls announced in multiple languages. Watching strangers rush toward futures in motion. And knowing that every gate is technically open, yet practically inaccessible. That is the quiet severity of his existence. Not isolation in wilderness. Not captivity behind walls. But suspension within infrastructure. He was not trapped by geography. He was trapped by definition. In the end, the airport did what it was designed to do: it moved everyone else forward. It processed tickets, verified identities, facilitated departures. The system worked. It simply did not work for him. And that may be the most unsettling truth of all, that a system can function efficiently while leaving a person immobilized inside it. Not as an act of cruelty, but as a byproduct of rigidity. A man seated in transit for nearly 3 decades. Surrounded by motion. Defined by stillness. Living proof that in the modern world, identity is not only who you are, it is whether the system agrees. There is a structural irony in living inside a place designed for impermanence. An airport is engineered for throughput. Architecture, lighting, signage, everything directs bodies forward. Arrows on floors. Gates assigned and reassigned. Timetables counting down to departure. Even seating is transitional, arranged for waiting, not dwelling. Nasseri occupied a space never meant to be inhabited, and in doing so, he exposed how fragile the concept of temporary really is. Temporary is a privilege. It assumes an endpoint. It assumes progression. When progression is removed, temporary mutates into indefinite. And indefinite, stretched across years, becomes a form of quiet permanence. Consider the sensory environment. The constant hum of ventilation systems. The periodic echo of boarding announcements in multiple languages. The rolling thunder of luggage wheels. The artificial lighting that erases natural circadian cues. Most travelers experience this for hours. He experienced it for decades. Human cognition adapts to repetition, but adaptation does not eliminate psychological cost. The absence of environmental variation compresses perception of time. Days blur. Weeks dissolve. There is also the economics of survival. Without formal status, employment is restricted. Without employment, income is unstable. Survival becomes dependent on ad hoc assistance, airport staff, charitable acts, occasional legal advocacy. This reinforces dependency while offering no structural solution. Charity can alleviate immediate need, but it does not repair legal invisibility. Over time, he became a narrative object. Journalists wrote about him. Travelers took photographs. His presence evolved from anomaly to legend within the terminal. Familiar to employees. Curious to visitors. But notoriety does not equate to agency. Being observed is not the same as being empowered. At a certain point, he reportedly began to lean into the identity that formed around him. A man without a country. A permanent passenger. When an environment reflects a version of you long enough, it can become self-reinforcing. Identity is partly internal construction and partly external feedback. If the only stable feedback loop you receive is "you belong here," in this in-between, the mind may accept it. This is the existential dimension of his story. It is not merely about paperwork. It is about what happens when institutional recognition and personal continuity diverge. When the state does not confirm who you are, how do you maintain that confirmation internally? Through routine. Through narrative. Through repetition. Routine becomes anchor. He reportedly read extensively. Newspapers, books, anything available. Reading is mobility without movement. Through text, he could traverse countries he could not physically enter. Knowledge substituted for travel. Imagination substituted for relocation. The mind compensates when the body is constrained. Yet intellectual escape does not dissolve physical boundaries. Each night he returned to the same seat, the same terminal. Each morning he woke beneath the same ceiling panels. Airports simulate global connection while being geographically fixed. He inhabited that paradox fully, surrounded by international routes, yet geographically immobile. There is also a broader geopolitical layer. Statelessness is not an anomaly, it is a persistent global issue. Political upheavals, shifting borders, revoked citizenship, administrative errors, all can produce individuals who exist outside formal national affiliation. Nasseri's case was highly visible because it occurred in a major international airport. Many others exist in less visible margins, refugee camps, detention centers, undocumented urban enclaves. His story is exceptional in location, not in principle. What makes it compelling is its symbolism. The airport is a symbol of globalization, fluidity, exchange, acceleration. A stateless man living there for 27 years is a contradiction embodied. Globalization promises interconnectedness, yet it relies heavily on documentation. Borders may feel porous to some, but they remain impermeable to others. Documentation is not just paper. It is legitimacy. It is permission. Without it, even the most technologically advanced infrastructure becomes impassable. Over decades, legal efforts were made. Offers presented. Papers arranged. But prolonged limbo can alter perception of resolution. When uncertainty becomes normal, change itself can feel destabilizing. There were moments when he could have exited under certain conditions. The reports suggest complexity, legal nuance, personal hesitation, procedural obstacles. The truth is likely layered. Human decisions rarely reduce to a single cause after decades of stasis. Imagine the psychological weight of stepping outside after nearly 3 decades. The world would not resemble the one you left. Cultural references shifted. Political landscapes reconfigured. Even currency changed in parts of Europe. The outside world would feel like an accelerated timeline you did not inhabit. Time is uneven. For travelers, time in airports is compressed and transactional. For him, it was expansive and suspended. The same clocks govern everyone, yet subjective experience diverged radically. There is a philosophical tension here between movement and existence. Modern identity often ties to mobility, where you can go, what passport you hold, how easily you cross borders. Mobility is equated with freedom. Immobility, with constraint. Nasseri's life challenges that binary. He existed, he read, he spoke, he interacted. He lived. Yet by mobility standards, he was profoundly constrained. This reframes freedom as layered. One can possess internal cognitive freedom while lacking external structural freedom. But structural freedom shapes opportunity. It defines the range of possible futures. Without recognized status, future options narrow dramatically. He became a case study in administrative inertia. Systems are optimized for the average case. Edge cases accumulate friction. Without coordinated intervention, friction becomes permanence. This is not necessarily malice, it is systemic design. Institutions prioritize throughput and predictability. Outliers demand resources. When urgency fades, resolution stalls. And yet, amid this structural analysis, there remains the human image, a man seated beneath departure screens, belongings arranged around him, observing a choreography of arrivals and departures that never included his own. Children who once stared at him in curiosity grew up and returned with their own children. Employees retired. Airlines rebranded. Security protocols intensified. Fashion changed. Technology advanced. He remained. That continuity transforms from anomaly to monument. Not a monument of stone, but of persistence. When he eventually left the terminal for medical reasons before his death, it marked a symbolic shift. The space that defined him for so long was no longer his environment. The story, however, remained anchored to that terminal in public memory. His life underscores a critical insight: modern systems are powerful, but they are brittle at their edges. They function with extraordinary efficiency within defined parameters. Outside those parameters, they can fail quietly and indefinitely. He was not forgotten. He was known. That is what complicates the narrative. Visibility did not equal resolution. Awareness did not automatically generate systemic correction. So the story endures not because of spectacle, but because of contrast. A man in permanent transit. A traveler without departure. A resident of a place designed to prevent residency. It forces a precise question about contemporary identity. If you remove documentation, nationality, and formal status, what remains? A person still breathes. Still thinks. Still remembers. Still hopes, even if hope evolves into something quieter. But in the architecture of states and borders, existence alone is insufficient. And that is the unsettling core of it, that in a hyper-connected world, a human being can sit at the center of global movement and remain unmoved, not by chains, not by walls, but by the absence of recognition. Surrounded by destinations. Excluded from departure. Alive within transit.